Hello again, KCIW listeners, and welcome to Curry Café. I'm Rick McNamer, producer and volunteer. Every Sunday, host Ray Gary puts together guests and volunteers to discuss topics of interest to our community. We also invite our listeners to text in their questions or comments on our text line at 541-661-4098. Again, that's 541-661-4098. Now here's Ray to tell us about today's show.
Yeah, we have a wonderful show set up for today. We're going to be talking about the environment, and we have experts who know everything there is to know. I'd like to just mention one thing about that text line. If you have trouble getting through, just keep trying. We'll get to them as quickly as we can. That's 541-661-4098. I know everybody has an opinion about what we're going to be talking about, so there's no excuse to not to. Sit down and type something out. So we'll go around the room now and everybody introduce themselves.
I'm Bill Gorham. I guess you'd say I'm an environmentalist. I worked as an environmental consultant for 30 years and then retired and focused a lot on climate change. As a marine biologist, I enjoy taking the dogs to the beach every day and do marine biology stuff.
I'm Dakotah Daly. I have a local consulting company called Teton Topo, and we practice radical geography. And radical geography is an idea that came from David Harvey, academic, and it's really about environmental justice. And my background is in cartography and map making. I first came out to the South Coast on the 2023 Smith River Complex, and now I do some work around environmental justice in town, working on maps. And we focus on indigenous communities and rural communities and wildfire risk reduction. So really happy to be in the studio with you all gentlemen today.
Okay. You want to start out with something, Rick?
Well, why not? Let me go right to you, Mr. Dakotah. We're talking about I gleaned a bunch of news items, but the one I was looking at that had to do with wildfires is there was a report out of one of the Sacramento news stations about clearing land and fuel breaks ahead of wildfires this year. And they were also talking about Oregon, too. And it was unusual because they were trying to get together the private and federal landowners, along with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Department of Forest Service, to talk about, obviously, bulldozing, I'm guessing, and clearing a lot of land ahead so they can have a fire break when and if the wildfires break out.
Yeah, I think that's a super important issue right now, and it's something to really pay attention to. We actually have similar efforts going on in this community here on the South Coast. We call those lines, we can make an analysis of the terrain and we can look where there might be a good place to stop a fire and identify that based on the terrain and the forest that's there right now. And we call those potential operational delineations, or PODs. And we're actually leading a PODs workshop here in town on the 31st, where the PODs for Curry County on the South Coast have already been pretty well mapped out. And there's work happening here on a local level through the Southern Oregon Forest Restoration Collaborative and the Wild Rivers Coast Forest Collaborative. And I'm helping do some of the analysis and some of the mapping of these PODs. And we're trying to go and do this clearing work now to try to preemptively make fire lines, because as everybody knows, wildfire risk is higher now than ever, and fuel reduction is the most meaningful intervention we have, because with the changing climate, we're facing drier conditions, hotter wildfire, and the biggest thing that we can actually interact with at a landscape level scale, since we're probably not going to be making colder summers very easily here at like a regional level.
Doesn't look like it.
So what we can do is we can go and we can do fuels reduction work, which is taking wildfire fuel trees out of the picture now. And fuel breaks are a really good way to do that. And one of the things I really like about what you brought up in particular is that it's multi-collaborator. There's a lot of different people who are involved, right? It's not just an agency, or it's not just the state, or it's not just private landowners. And personally, it's really inspiring to me because my big picture take on environmental issues is that we are in desperate need of collective, affirmative, generative action. You know, there's so much going on And when we see people coming together and finding things that are important to them and things that they can actually engage with, I think that that's really where the juice is. So I'm happy that's happening down there, and I'm really happy to be a part of similar efforts here in town as well.
And in the report, it said Oregon was included in a lot of this stuff.
Yeah,
Also, California and Oregon, because this is where the majority of the wildfires, there's a lot of them, but they seem to be.
Yeah, wildfires are bad out here, certainly. I mean, anybody who lives out here, lives in the West, really can tell you that. And one statistic I've heard that's really telling is that for every $1 that gets spent on preventative work, like doing fuels reduction, you can save $4 of emergency response. So the first time I ever visited the South Coast was on a suppression team. I was on a Type 1 team on the Smith River fire, and a Type 1 team with 2,000 people can be easily spending like $1 million a day. And during the peak of wildfire season on the West Coast, you can have a dozen Type 1 teams. And when I was on the Smith River, we were not the only Type 1 team on the Smith River. We were Type 1 Team South, and the Smith River Complex had an additional Type 1 team on the north side. So we're looking at 6 weeks on that fire before it started to rain, $1 million a day per team. And if you look at what you could do with the suppression cost of that one wildfire, which was not the only wildfire on the West Coast that year, not the only wildfire in Southern Oregon that summer, what you could do with the amount of money that goes into suppression by doing preventative work like fuels reduction, it just takes a little bit of forward thinking, an organization. And luckily we do have some resources and some folks like Tabitha Rood, who was on the show last week.
Great example.
She is just doing amazing work bringing money into the community to do some of this fuels maintenance.
And she's a big advocate of, she and others, of trying to get people to get some working together. Now, the one in this report, what I didn't see was any really maybe hardcore, which I am a hardcore environmentalist, but I didn't see anybody putting up a argument against that. But I imagine there might be some environmental groups that I don't know if it's going to require cutting down some redwoods or something in certain areas.
Yeah.
That would be pretty shaky.
Yeah.
But, so...
Well, I think it touches on a lot of interesting philosophical and kind of cultural issues. Like there's a lot of folks, I grew up in wildfire country in the Rocky Mountains, and a lot of folks are against prescribed burning. And there's two big things that I hear when people talk against prescribed burning. And one is the escape. Wildfires can escape and they can cause a lot of damage. So why are we going and starting wildfires?
And that's happened.
Yeah, absolutely has happened. And I think it only takes being close to a wildfire during the middle of a wildfire season to understand that that is not a unique risk to prescribed burning, and that it really is the lesser of two evils. And even an escaped prescribed burn is a lot less destructive than a wildfire during the middle of the summer. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is that historically these landscapes have had a disturbance regime of about every 10 years. And what that means is that we're looking on a larger scale, like pre-colonization on the West Coast. On average, and it's a little bit longer here, right on the coast, but generally in the West, about every 10 years, landscapes experienced wildfire. So this mountain, every 10 years, for 30,000 years, while Native Americans were living here, was lit on fire, either through a natural wildfire or through the cultivation of a fire to maintain a certain homeostasis in that ecosystem. So when we're looking at like fuels reduction work and cutting trees down, we can either do that in a way that's intentional and selective and is going to be a part of trying to mimic a natural disturbance that's closer to a historically healthy baseline. Or we can witness wildfires which are burning at temperatures that are so hot. I mean, I work in wildfire modeling, and the temperature of wildfires over the last 3 years has broken our mathematical understandings of what wildfire does to an environment in terms of the effect that it has on soil and the depth at which it's able to actually make the compounds in the soil evaporate and destroy phosphorus and nitrogen way, way, way down, as opposed to low severity fire, which is actually really regenerative for a landscape. And the other thing that people tend to say about prescribed fire is smoke. And this is the smoke in the air, I think, is a really, really interesting issue. And smoke is a health concern. It's a health concern for some people more than other people. And smoke forecasting and smoke safety are really, really important things to be talking about when it comes to wildfire and prescribed fire. And if you think about the 100 years that we had under Smokey the Bear of what the Forest Service called the 9 a.m. policy, where for 100 years, wildfires were supposed to be put out by 9 a.m. the morning after they were discovered. So for 100 years, we had full suppression. Just put every fire out that you possibly can. And that's, in some places, that's starting to change at a federal level as a priority. But if you think about the image in the American mind, in the memory of growing up and having blue sky summers every summer, that's actually something that is kind of an invention of colonial culture, is an invention of the Smokey the Bear suppression wildfire management, because realistically for 30,000 years under native stewardship, these lands were having fire every single summer. Smoke in the air, in addition to burning trees, are a part of the natural disturbance cycles. And it's a little bit of smoke in the air is actually required in order to have a healthy forest. So we got to cut down trees. We got to light things on fire. And I am a hardcore environmentalist, and I really believe that tooth and nail. And I think we got to be really smart about what we cut and what we burn. So,
Well, and it's an ongoing, learn as we go, I suppose. I was just on this same report, they're planning on, it sounded a little low to me, but their plan is to put in another 400 miles added to the already fire lines that they've created. And they want to complete it they're going to start this May, and they want it completed by 2028. Well, that's
great.
See where that goes. And I guess we're going to have to wait and see. Hopefully that's going to be a positive influence, because every year it seems like we have some ugly, destructive.
Brooklyn is getting ready to burn right now in New York. I mean, the fires are everywhere right now.
I didn't. Really? That's going on?
Yeah.
Biggest fires in decades in that part of the East Coast.
Yeah.
Ignorant of that. And here we go. Well, anyway, that's all good stuff. Well, Mr. Bill, I know you...
Could I ask Dakotah just one quick
Go
question?
for it.
Everybody else may know the answer. How wide are these fire breaks? Are they 100 yards, 50 yards?
So I think generally a shaded fuel break is a little bit wider than a single blade dozer, which I'm not going to say actually how many feet it is, because I'm afraid I'm going to get it wrong, but they're not huge oftentimes. And it depends on different projects. They could be planning different things, and potential operational delineations like shaded fuel breaks, they are super important. And I think it is also important to keep in mind of the context of in 2021, for the first time in recorded history, there was a wildfire that jumped the Sierra mountain range. And the second time that it happened was the day after that on a different part of the range. And it's because we're starting to see wildfire happen under certain sets of conditions. We call it when there's an alignment of conditions. And when wildfire is in alignment, it's not becoming unusual anymore in a changing climate that wildfires can send entire trees up that are candles, totally engulfed in flames, that land 2 miles from where they lifted the ground, because of the amount of heat creating so much rise in air, creating entire weather systems. So that's another reason I think fuel reduction are an important emphasis to have, because like if you're doing a prescribed burn or you're doing a thinning treatment, you're able to, at a landscape level, reduce the amount of fuel in the entire patch, where a potential operational delineation is like a place not only to create a fuel break, but it's also a place to get crews in there, get equipment in there, and to be able to have access to be doing a suppression effort. So you're making an entry point for a wildfire operation, for a wildfire suppression.
So so these fire breaks are, you say, 1 blade wide, so let's call it 10 feet for a big cat. And that's wide enough to stop a fire from moving or slow it down?
It could be, and it could also be enough to get people and equipment into there, which could be enough to make a critical intervention. And potential operational delineations are a really important measure to be putting in. And like I said, it's important to keep, for me, within the context of wildfire risk in general, where if you're creating a bunch of fuel breaks between 2 tender boxes, and you're having trees that are on fire fly 2 miles through the air,
Yeah.
then 100 dozer lines is not going to stop that fire.
Right.
And it doesn't matter how much money. There's wildfire that you can't put out with the technology we have, if no matter how many helicopters you have. So I think fuels reduction work is a really important piece of the puzzle as well.
Okay.
One thing I'm curious about is the fuels reduction. You're talking about taking out trees and understory, and that is combined with the control burns, right? The set burns. Now, I know there are people that are concerned about, like you said, the smoke, but for the trees to then be an excuse to do logging, and that's very contentious. What's your sense of the different sides there? How it's set?
Yeah, it's an interesting issue. And so a fuels reduction could include like a prescribed burn. That could be one, like fuel reduction would be anything that's reducing the amount of fuel that could be live, which also I think the best case scenario and the best alternative we have is biochar, which is kind of becoming an increasingly popular word. But biochar it's a fancy word for super pure charcoal, where when you get a fire burning really hot in an oxygen lean environment, you're left with a wood product which has incredible benefits to the microbial makeup of the soil. And there's increasing technology that actually will go out into the field and essentially take like a pile burn and kind of choke it so there's less oxygen, so you get more coal that's left over. And they say like a tablespoon of biochar has a football field of surface area, which means that it retains water really well, and it also retains microbes really well. And soil health in a lot of ways is the name of the game in the wildfire issue, because obviously that's where the forest is coming from, and healthy soil leads to more resilient ecosystems. I think that if we can the reason that fuels reduction work isn't happening at scale is because it's not economical. So I think if we can make it lucrative to do fuels reduction work, every person in the West Coast is going to benefit from that, I believe, because we're looking at some alternatives which are not going to help with wildfire. We're looking at clear cutting, which is going to be really, really devastating to ecosystem health, both locally and globally. And I've heard this is kind of an anecdote, but I've heard that if you took everybody who was trained in all of the equipment that we had and you started doing fuels reduction work year round, like if you employed everybody who had a firefighter certification, everybody who was involved in forestry, then over the next 10 years, we'd be able to do less than 1% of the fuels reduction work that we need to. So I think if we can make it, and that's not happening because people aren't making money off of it. So I think if we can make logging smarter, if we can make sustainable harvest benefit wildfire risk, then I'm all for it. Because I think if you get too pure into like environmentalism as the idea that we shouldn't be touching the landscape, I think is as dangerous as just saying, you know what, climate change isn't a real thing. Environmental issues aren't a big deal. Humans aren't having a big impact. I think what we really do need to be thinking about is how to be having healthy interaction with the landscape. And that doesn't mean a no-take policy. I think being smarter about the resources that we pull and having multiple benefits from them are a helpful thing. But it does become a slippery slope, right? When one becomes a doorway and almost like a Trojan horse to let industry come in.
Yeah, I mean,
Thanks for bringing that up.
It's interesting because the lumber industry or the forestry industry is critically important as a renewable resource. When you have lumber that is going to be taking carbon and sequestering it away in buildings and things like that, and you just look around, you don't see very many housing developments that aren't built with lumber. Yeah. And so if we don't reasonably, intelligently log the resources we have here, then they're going to be coming from elsewhere. Yeah. And so it's, again, I absolutely agree with you. It's that discussions we have to try to see where do we not have any losers. We have to have the best we can to have not winners and losers, but everybody is winning and giving up some things and preserving much, much more. So those conversations are absolutely required.
And I'm looking forward to getting into at some point in the show what you're doing in SoCan, because I think that that's a really cool example, again, of this kind of collective generative approach and being creative, because none of these issues have silver bullets. I think that's something that for a lot of folks, like I definitely experience social political fatigue of just being like,
Ooh, I think we all do.
right? I mean, holy
I
smokes.
certainly do.
I was listening to the news this morning and washing dishes, and I almost snapped the plate in half. So I just, listening to some of this stuff, right, is exhausting for all of us. And I think conversations like this are really cool. Conversations like you're having at SoCan are really cool. And yeah.
That is a big deal. That is a big deal. I had something right there and it left me, but that happens a lot. Well, back to, I was going to say, Bill, I know your expertise, of course, is the coastline. I'm going there basically, but the wildfires, if they're close to the coast and they flood the rivers with the ash, and that's got to affect the flora and fauna, if you will, on our coastline.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's when you have, especially as Dakotah was saying, the fire conditions have changed so much, and it's one thing to have the natural fire. I mean, it's a fire controlled community. It's what's developed over time, and with the Smoky Bear put it out by 9. That changed things so much, so that when you do have that fire, and especially a way out of control fire, then you have a lot more of the sediments going to go into the rivers, which is going to choke out the eggs and the small fish, the fry. It's going to make them warmer, especially because if you have the tree cover that's near the streams that is now gone, then it's going to make so many different things change. And so the integrated effort is critically important, and that carries through for the salmon that are going to go out there and then be caught on the way back. So there are so many different components to it. To try to break it down and just do one aspect as opposed to a holistic approach is not a recipe for success.
Yeah. And living up here, it is just I was today, before I came here, I took a quick little walk there on near Chetco Point. I didn't make it up all the way, but I got part way down. And just sitting there, I mean, we're in the most magnificent place of beauty. Mm-hmm. Again, flora and fauna. It makes me just think about it more and appreciate it more. Yeah. Go ahead.
That's one of the things that we're trying to do is to an aspect of encouraging climate activism is to have people start to appreciate to acknowledge what they appreciate. What is it about the ocean, the hikes, the vistas? What is it that you care about that you then want to get other people to care about for changes? That's where paintings, photographs, stories, poems, that sort of aspect is critically important. One of the things we're trying to start doing is capturing, and we talked about it at our last meeting last Tuesday at SoCan, was to get stories, short stories of people locally that have been here for a long enough time to have seen changes. And are the changes something that they are saying, well, that's normal over the course of 200 years, except I'm not sure there are a whole lot of 200-year people, except some that are collecting Social Security, we hear.
Yeah. And they're too busy spending that money to be bothered with the things you're talking about.
That's true. So anyway, the point is to get the stories across the board of people that are hunters or that are fishers or that are hikers, that are just so that they can say, yes, over time we've seen these things. Admittedly, nature has very long-term cycles, no question about that. But for the most part, many of the things we are pushing those cyclic time frames to ridiculous levels. So try to capture what's abnormal versus what's normal. And then the other thing about the climate change, people deny it, but it seems so counterproductive to me, because if you've got a problem and you are part of a problem, you are part to making that problem. If you recognize it, then you can fix it. if you say it doesn't exist, it's, well, kind of like when the Cascadia Fault goes out there. I don't know anybody that's going to make a difference as to when it's going to go. When it goes, we're all going to be affected. Climate change is not going to be as dramatic and immediate as the Cascadia Fault, but the impacts are going to be significant. And as compared to some of the current administration, as I understand from this morning, the same sort of thing, we don't need to be trying to stop it. We just need to adapt to it. It's like, yeah.
This is, I think, one of the most interesting conversations for me to be having around conservation and environmentalism is conservation psychology. And there's been some really, really interesting research that's done in this, because if you take the same kind of approach in psychology and look at education, and you look at a classroom of students, let's say we're talking about middle schoolers, there's different psychological theories that show that students are going to resolve and they're going to respond better to some sorts of teaching than other sorts of teaching. And one of the things that's been found in psychology is that students are not going to learn, they're not going to be in their most receptive environment when they're being taught through fear and shame. So if kids are being hit, and let's say maybe this is more of an old school classroom where kids are being yelled at when they're getting things wrong, these kids, their brains, from a neurological perspective, are less receptive to learning. And the same thing can be said with a change in how people respond to climate change. So when climate change messaging is, the world is going to end and this is our fault, this is your fault, you're driving a diesel truck, people get defensive and people get angry. Now, the other thing that's interesting in this conversation to me is the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. And an extrinsic motivation is an external factor, and the easiest ones to think about are money. So like I might be extrinsically motivated to participate in recycling because every time I recycle a can, I get a nickel back. And I drink a lot of soda, so I'm making a little bit of money because I'm being extrinsically motivated to participate in this conservation scheme. An intrinsic motivation would be something that is tapping into more of my sense of relatedness to other people, my sense of competence, my sense of autonomy in the world, kind of these main psychological needs that we have as human beings, like this way that I orient myself to the world and I relate to the world, and this is what makes me feel good about myself and my place in the world is I'm recycling these cans because I feel like that's going to make the world a better place for the community and all these people that I live in. So the other research that's been shown in this area is that when you have an extrinsic motivation for somebody to participate in conservation or do something to take better care of the environment, as soon as you withdraw that extrinsic motivation, the behavior stops. So conservation incentives that appeal to people's intrinsic motivations, if they're done in a way that can tap into people's sense of relatedness to each other and the things they care about, like the stories of like hunting and fishing, that from purely just a strategic perspective is a lot more effective than either the doom and gloom narrative or trying to incentivize people through an external motivator like money.
Well, we did get a text, but I just want to, and if you're enjoying the show as much as I'm sure Ray also, both Ray and I are.
This is amazing. Yeah.
It is. And our text line again, 541-661-4098. And Linda has texted in, Bill, could you talk about what SOCAN is and what SOCAN does on a local level?
That's a good question. Thank you for the opportunity. SOCAN is Southern Oregon Climate Action Now. And it's an organization that's been around for about 12 years. It was organized in the Rogue Valley. About 6 years ago, Ed Patterson talked to the people at SOCAN and said, we'd like to do something out here on the coast. And so I was with Ed and a number of other people, and we started what we called Coastal SOCAN. So it's just a group within SOCAN. And SOCAN is, just by the name, it says climate action now. We try to focus on that. What we were doing before COVID, which shut down so many different things, we were having regular meetings and we would have lectures or related sorts of things. In fact, just before COVID, we were planning a pretty big event out at SWAC for the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. Now, I'm of a vintage that I remember the first Earth Day. And so we were very disappointed when we had to cancel all that. The benefit was that we had lined up at least a dozen speakers for there, and we used those for the subsequent monthly meetings. That was great, but then because of all the effects of COVID and difficulty of getting together, we didn't continue it as effectively as we should have. Well, now, with more attention to the environment and more opportunities to get together and trying to get people re-engaged and become active, we're doing more sort of a reboot. The second meeting we had was last Tuesday, and we're trying to do it roughly once a month. What we are hoping to do is, again, stir action, and that is based on the level of motivation and interest and capacities and situation of individuals. So it's kind of a one size does not fit all. Some people really want to get involved and want to plant trees or clear overgrown brush that is hiding a stream. Other people don't have the resources and are more interested in writing letters or lobbying elected officials. Or some people get into the point of wanting to be one of those elected officials. And so it requires everybody to be involved. And that means that there's room for everybody. So to the extent that we can show people different ways that they can be involved, that's the objective right now. So it's an education, a motivation, different ways of recognizing that because we aren't trying to push guilt of you're the problem, rather than we are all the problem. Many positives came from burning fossil fuels, but now we know better, and there are alternatives. Let's attack those alternatives. Mm-hmm. So
agreed. And as an attendee of the as an attendee of the SOCAN meetings, yes, I believe they're inspiring, they're fun, and they're very important. And I'm glad to be part of that. Actually, we all have been to the meetings.
Yeah, I missed the last one just because I forgot it.
Well, you're
I
81.
Got to talk to
I have to have a better way of reminding myself, other than writing it on my calendar.
That's okay.
Well,
That's
keep
But
in
I
mind,
look at it at like 10 o'clock in the morning, and that meeting was at 4.
You know, I did write down, we were talking about the environment, and I had a bunch of stories, of course, a bunch of stuff that I came across. And a couple of positives was, and I want to talk about that, is the sea otters in Elkhorn Slough, Moss Landing, California, taking care of, they had a terrible green crab, never heard of them before, but a green crab problem there in the estuary. And they were capturing a bunch, trying to figure out, they're just multiplying. Well, all of a sudden, out of the blue, I should say, the sea otters, they noticed the sea otters coming in on their own. And before too long, the green crab problem was, I don't know about handled, but a lot better than it was. And I just thought, hey, maybe the earth is okay. Sometimes it can naturally take care of herself. That was a positive. And the other positive was removing the dams on the Klamath. So far, I know that's, again, controversial as heck, but I think there's been early progress on that already. So that was a plus. But anyway, Bill, I did want to talk about a little more about these sea otters. And yeah, they're so cute and fun, and they're one of my favorite animals, so it's easy to get wrapped up into that. But I think it's they're
very curious, too, about people.
Yes, they are.
Yeah,
swim up to you. And,
if you've surfed down there at Moss Landing, surely you've spent some time with those guys.
yeah.
Yes.
I took a kayaking trip once when I lived in Alaska in, I forget the name of the body of water, but it's a body of water where cruise ships come through all the time. Now, I'm out here in a kayak, and sea otters are very common in that body of water. And they will be out there swimming, and a big cruise ship with 5 billion people on it and making noise and everything can go down through the inlet, and the sea otters pretty much just completely ignore it. I come along in my kayak, and they're gone in a second. So I'm thinking what this has to be is some time of an an inherited memory of kayaks not good.
Yeah, no kidding.
Nobody's hunting them from a cruise ship, though.
Yes.
Well, I have to say I love that story just because to me, it's shedding the light on using existing ecosystem dynamics that we know work and using those as interventions and thinking about a different approach to bringing back a sort of ecosystem balance as opposed to just introducing more technology, right? Which oftentimes makes issues.
Right.
Technology oftentimes lends itself to maintenance and updates and complications that we haven't seen yet, as opposed to doing something like bringing back what is already, we know these are keystone species in those ecosystems. They're also charismatic and super cute. And it turns out that they were playing a really important function in this ecosystem.
Yeah. And I did want to branch out a little bit. Not everybody is totally happy with all of that. It's man interfering. And Bill alerted me to an article that I read, and I was a little surprised, but a lot of the tribes, and I'm a big backer. If the indigenous people want it, I think it should be done pretty much. But I was surprised that there were some tribes that were not happy with the reintroduction of sea otters in certain areas because they were kind of devastating what they were harvesting at the time for themselves. And it was a Dungeness crab, shellfish, and I think razor clams. But yeah, and so they were they didn't want them to start reintroducing sea otters in that area.
Well, actually, there's a couple of different stories there. First off, the sea otters were not reintroduced to Elkhorn Slough.
No, correct. That was totally on their own.
Nature managed to rebalance things.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I bristle at is when people say, "Oh, we're killing the earth." It's like, nope, we're changing the earth. We may change it to the extent that we can't survive, but there were 5 major extinction events. And if it weren't for the asteroid that wiped out the dinosaurs, we would not be here. I attended a lecture that said it's serendipity. That asteroid allowed us to be here.
Oh, wow.
So Mother Nature is really resilient if given an opportunity. So with all the fur traders that really prize the sea otter pelt because it is the thickest pelt known in the mammals, because they don't have blubber. They have just the thick coat that they have to continue to preen. They eat something like 25% of their body weight every day. They're voracious predators because they're little, large surface area, and in very cold water. So they were wiped out. They thought it was completely wiped out, but there's a small population off Big Sur. And that eventually spread back once they were not being hunted around Monterey. And I have a good story having dived in Monterey and having something that crawled over my back. I wasn't sure what it was. And there was a sea otter there. And he wasn't very, they're very big when you're about 2 feet away from them. Mm-hmm. Their teeth are that way. So I bumped him on the nose. He got back at me because when I got to the surface, he had stolen my snorkel. They're very curious, really cool animals, I have to admit. Anyway, so they have been moving around, expanding more back into Monterey Bay. Now, Elkhorn Slough was taken over by the green crabs, like you said. If I understand it correctly, it was from Europe. It was introduced because of the invasive species to San Francisco Bay. Eventually got it down to Moss Landing, to the Elkhorn Slough. Because they are such voracious predators, the sea otters found this wonderful resource and were eating them. And I forget the number exactly, but it's something like 100,000 a year, or maybe more than that, that are being eaten. And it's interesting because the sea otters don't go into the upper reaches of the estuary, and so apparently in the upper regions that have been isolated by trenching and things to make it for farms, the green crabs are still there. Mm. And it's where the otters are able to access that they've been, fortunately, decimated. Now, if you're going to be having that much of an energy demand, you're going to be eating everything you can. They do seem to favor the urchins, but they also would love, just like we do, abalone and the Dungeness crabs and lots of other things. So it's a delicate balance that we've got. Now, there's an interesting story about sea otters and abalone. Anne Velisis, who's the president of the Kalmiopsis Audubon, is an author, written a book called Abalone, and it gives the whole history of things. So talking about an ecological system that's in balance, when the abalone fisheries were going crazy because there were so many, that's because the sea otters had been wiped out. So what was the right balance? What if we took a picture at any specific moment, is that the baseline? Well, no, it varies as to that perspective. Now, moving forward, saying because we knew that the sea otters have appeared from, I don't know how far south in Southern California, but all the way up through Alaska and over to Japan, they were a major predator. When they were removed, then things changed around. Now, if you start reintroducing them, now that's humans making decisions about how Mother Nature is going to work. There's the unintended, unexpected consequences that could come out of that. Now, as a major predator, they're going to eat whatever they can. They love crabs. You have green crabs, but they'll also love the other crabs, the market crabs. So how do you control that? They've been introduced before, and they didn't succeed for a variety of reasons. So it's like anything else. It's going to take trade-offs. It's going to be having to look at what's the right thing to do as best we can, acknowledging the different people that have different stakes in the game, so to speak.
Right. Balance. And how hard is that to achieve these days?
Yeah,
I mean,
impossible.
I think that back to what Tabitha and everybody were talking about, compromise, we can do this. But when man starts to interfere, there's a lot of bad stuff that can happen, it seems.
Well, Ray, I see you've got something to say, but I also...
No, go ahead.
Okay, I think that this is a really interesting conversation because what we're talking about is humans, right?
Right.
Making decisions about what's going to happen in the environment and how the environment is going to respond is the only option we have. And acting like there's an alternative is a fantasy. Because even this idea of stepping back and saying, we're not going to do anything, that's not really an option because we're eating. I know I am. I'm breathing. I'm going to use the bathroom. And all of those things are a part of the ecosystem, and we are an extension of the ecosystem, right? And there's an interesting idea that one piece of American history that exemplifies this really well is the Weeks Act in 1911, which set up the United States Forest Service and the park system. And that was iconic and has had a massive impact, and a lot of our American history and ideas about nature have come from that and related to that. And obviously the Forest Service and the park system is still a part of our land management and our idea of how we relate to nature today. But this idea of an ecosystem outside of man's touch is something that we, speaking as somebody who has European ancestry, that we brought over with us from Europe. And it was an idea that was not culturally present before we got here. Because humans, as an extension of the landscape, are going to be making decisions and are going to be pulling on all of these different levers and killing something that has a domino effect all the way through the ecosystem. And that's just something that is part of the baggage and the weight of being born in a human body on Earth, no matter when or where you are. You are a part of the ecosystem. And I think breaking through that and breaking through this idea of like in the academic literature on this and like the cultural studies, it's talked about as the virgin wilderness or like the pristine wilderness. And I think it's worth bringing up because it's something that a lot of people still have in our minds. And it's such a strong cultural artifact. And I even find myself like running up against it in my own imagination all the time of this idea of a landscape where there is a baseline, where there's some picture of health without humans, and that if we could just get out of the way of us parasite on the planet and we're messing everything up and we shouldn't be trying to control and dominate nature, we have to be in relationship to nature. And this idea of a baseline ecosystem health, when the Europeans got here, they said, oh, wow, look at this massive, beautiful garden that God made. we need to make sure that the local people don't mess this up. So we're going to get rid of them, and we're going to put national parks up, and we're going to choose places where we're going to cut down all of the forests and places where we don't touch the forest. Where what was actually existing on this land where we are now when the Europeans came over was not a natural, beautiful, pristine, virgin wilderness. It was a landscape that had been created by the cultivation of human hands and human communities for 30,000 years on the West Coast.
Doesn't that kind of harken back to the old, one of my bugaboos is the manifest destiny. God gave us this, it's ours.
Yep.
Get out of the way.
Yep.
I mean, that's part of it.
And conservation as, there's a term, I'm not sure if I'm going to get it right, but like fence and border conservation is this idea that protecting natural resources means we don't touch them.
Yeah.
Which is, it's a European invention because nowhere in no indigenous community in the world were there ever an indigenous community that just didn't interact with the ecosystem.
Right.
And there's not really a colonial one either, but we certainly like to buy into the idea that it's a possibility.
And another controversy I'll throw in real quick, but is the population. I mean, the humans keep going. There's a lot of us out there, and a lot of, I think that could be part of the problem, but that's just my little thing there.
Keep growing and we keep building and we keep saying
I mean,
we can make money out of this.
There are
Let's put
finite.
a hotel up here. Let's
But
do that.
at the same time, there's enough food to feed everybody on Earth. Easily. There is actually much more food than we need. And there are some people that are living on the planet that have as much of an ecological impact as 100 other people.
Balance.
So
Get it,
there's,
maybe.
even with the amount of people that we have, there's still a lot of cultural decisions that get made that determine what our impact are, because not all cultural ideas of relating to nature have the same impact, even with the amount of people we have as a given.
An interesting story that I read this morning, and I think it was in the AP, was that in order to, I think it had to do with solar energy in Africa, and the program was something like $160 billion, just a massive amount of money, incredible. And then they said that would be, I think it was a quarter or maybe a half of Elon Musk's wealth. So he could invest half of his wealth and have installation of electrical energy, electrical power in Africa. It's like, my God, that is such an imbalance. It's shocking.
And he
No,
could also
even
buy
if-
food and housing and education for every human on Earth.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Even if Elon didn't do it, they could get a half a dozen of him and his buddies to go play golf one day and say, hey, let's save this country. Let's do this. Let's put
That
the
ain't
solar
going to
panels
happen,
in
I don't
place.
think. Balance. We keep coming, or I keep thinking about that. And I'll go back to the article that, Bill, you turned me on to about this, the otter. I was reading. It's just whose idea. So it was God, I hope I get this right, the Quinault Indian Nation up in Washington, who also didn't want the sea otters. And they said at one time, it was 1997, they had 26, roughly, sea otters. And then 2019, there was 2,300 of them. Now, my point is, well, what is the normal? What is right? To me, I'm for the 2,300, but I'm not living off the ocean or the coast up there like they are.
That will
So-
balance eventually, though, the way it's supposed to be.
Well, will it? I don't know, but
It's a
that's
moving
my
target.
point. So what's that?
It's a moving target, balance.
You have a predator-prey thing. When there's too many predators for the prey, then the predators start to back off.
Well,
Yeah.
one of the problems, the issue that we have right here is the loss of kelp. And the kelp are being lost because there are so many urchins. And the urchins are being lost because their predators are gone. And that would have been more historically the otters, but there have been a die-off of some of the major predatory sea stars. And there's one, the sun star, that is about the size of a bushel basket. It's got 36 arms, and it's a horrendous, or very effective predator. Well, with the sea star wasting disease, those have disappeared to a large extent. And now the predators, going back to that, are gone, and the sea urchins are having what they call sea barrens or urchin barrens. There's so many packed together, which means there's no chance for a young kelp spore to grow up to be a kelp plant. No kelp, there's not going to be room for the fish that live in the kelp forests. That affects everything all the way up to whales because you have the different trophic layers in there. So it's when, as Dakotah is talking about, when we lose that balance, everything can get tossed on its head. And so, well, where do we start from? Where do we make sure that we aren't causing more trouble than we are creating? So I mentioned the one example that I think is one of the most, it's almost funny in a way, but it's not. In Australia, it's interesting, they had a problem with the cane beetle. And they figured a cane beetle's living on the cane, and so they brought in the cane toad. Great idea. Cane toads would eat the cane beetle if they came in contact. Trouble is, cane beetles live at the top of the cane. Cane toads don't climb cane. And so they ended up having these toads that were way more effective at populating all of Australia than the other amphibians. And so it became a massive problem. And they are toxic to the extent that if predators eat them, they'll die. And small doses, apparently some dogs have learned to lick them and get nasty highs. But the idea is here was a way of taking care of one problem, and we created a much worse problem. So thinking twice, thinking 4 times, however many times you want to do before making a decision like that, looking at unintended consequences, is where those conversations have to come in. Because you need the voices of people saying, did you think about this? Mm-hmm. Did you think about that?
The idea of introducing one species to wipe out another has failed so many times in the world. It's surprised that people still think of doing it. They have, what do they have in Hawaii?
All sorts of invasives.
Yeah.
Yeah, they introduced to take care of the rats.
Was it the frog?
Oh, the ferrets?
No,
Probably or mongoose?
I know on
mongoose,
Kauai where I used to live, we have the
and
worst
what
rooster
they didn't realize is
infestation.
that mongoose also like chicken.
Yeah.
So
Rooster?
Yeah, the roosters on Kauai, horrible. But I want to bring up a book that came out recently called How to Love a Forest. And it's by a guy called Ethan Tapper, and I highly, highly recommend it for anybody who's trying to add some nuance to how they're relating to the environment and how to make sense of some of the environmental changes and really like what it means to be alive as a human being and care for the environment in today's age. And Ethan Tapper is a guy who was born and raised in Vermont, and he had a long career in forestry. And it's his story as he bought a small piece of land and he's doing everything that he can to take care of it. And an image that comes to my mind, it's not used in the book, but it's almost as if this piece of land he bought is a zombie, in the way that if you compare it to the way that this piece of land looked, again, pre-contact, you would not be able to recognize the ecosystem that you have now. And it's really applicable to what is happening here on the West Coast, because I think for somebody who might not have a super nuanced understanding of the ecosystems out here, you can look at a stand of trees and think, wow, I'm so happy that this is here. What a beautiful, dense, healthy forest ecosystem. And that could be the growth of a bunch of Doug firs, which are essentially seen as an invasive species here on the coast at a super unhealthy density, completely homogenized landscape with very little diversity, and is just getting ready to burn down in a super high severity wildfire while smothering out any of the biodiversity that's there. So just the quantity of a species in an ecosystem isn't necessarily associated with the health. And if you really start to look at, well, what would a healthy ecosystem in this place be like? The coast mountains used to be up to 50% prairies. And the prairies are actually a really important ecosystem. And they're now down to 1% of this area. But we tend to think like, oh, forest is better. And we have all of this really dense Doug fir. I don't want to run out the clock here, but I do want to say Ethan's book, he talks about how this kind of zombie forest that we have now that might be full of aspens that look really beautiful. Before contact on the East Coast, aspen trees were 6 feet in diameter. And I grew up in an aspen forest, and I didn't even know that was within the range of possibility for that species. I grew up with my entire life with this shifted baseline, like Bill was talking about, of this is what was normal for me just because I was born at this time. And this is what aspen forest I thought always looked like. But if I went 50 years back, 100 years back, it'd be different. But he buys this piece of land and he's using a chainsaw and he's using a backpack with glyphosate and he's going around this piece of property and he's spraying ground up on invasive species that his neighbors might think, you know, what the heck is this guy doing spraying these chemicals? But this is a guy who's really taken the time to understand the nuances of the ecosystem. And he is bold enough, which I think is harder and harder to do in this day and age, to take a stand and say, it's worth it for me on this piece of land. I'm going to love this forest by introducing this chemical because I'm going to give these other species, which are being overgrown by these invasive, a chance to live by using ground up on my land. And I'm going to use a chainsaw to try to create a patchy habitat. And a patchy habitat is what creates room for biodiversity instead of homogeneous trees of stands that are all look like a farm or they're all the same. So really powerful book, really cool story. And I think truthfully it takes, to be alive now and be passionate about environmentalism takes learning to love the zombie landscape that we live in because things are different and things are decaying and dying and growing back in new ways that we have to be able to pay attention to these nuances and get rid of any idea of a balance or a baseline really because that's a fantasy.
Yeah, nature is absolutely dynamic. That's why the example of the otters coming back into Elkhorn Slough and establishing a new baseline, but it was by eating up an invasive species. And so it's like, it's going to recover. Again, our species eventually will be gone. And whether it's in 10 years or 10,000 years, who knows? But nature does persist, which is a good thing.
Life finds a way.
Life finds a way, absolutely.
To quote that guy in Jurassic Park.
Yeah. Adding another book is Robin Kimmerer is a woman that wrote Braiding Sweetgrass.
What was that, Bill? I'm sorry?
Braiding Sweetgrass. And she is an indigenous woman who also has, I believe it's a PhD in botany. And so she talks about having feet in sort of two different worlds. And the botany, the science of distilling things down into individual parts, which is almost an antithesis to the holistic view of the indigenous people being grateful for the lives they've taken from this tree or from that elk, whatever, because it's all part together, and appreciating it and appreciating that we are all working together. So.
Wow, I hate to say this, but yeah, we are running out of time here. But I definitely want to thank Bill and Dakotah for being our guest today. A lot of eye-opening stuff. I had, do I have time? I'm going to try to get this in real quick, Bill. You said something about people. It'll be great to talk to people that were here a long time. Today at Chetco Point, I noticed I do see a little bit of kelp out there once in a while, but I imagine at one time that whole bay area was probably full.
I'm sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's kind of sad. Like I said, you just see a little tiny patch.
Yeah.
But okay, so
I would just like to say
yes,
I want to thank Dakotah for being here because he's probably younger than the rest of us.
Probably.
The enthusiasm, the excitement, the engagement, all of that
wonderful.
Is critically important.
It is. We're going to depend on the smart youth to take care of our problems.
Well, hey, it's been
all
super
on you.
fun hanging out with y'all. And I also want to take a moment to plug my show. I'm starting a show on KCIW 100.7. So starting next week, Tuesdays at 3 o'clock, you can tune into the Daily Weekly. We're going to be listening to new songs from old souls. So if you want to hear some contemporary music that's got a little bit of dust on it, why don't you come on in and join us?
We will do that. And we're excited at KCIW for that, let me tell you.
And thank you very much for everybody for appearing today.
You bet. Okay, well, again, I won't give the text line because it won't matter.
No.
So, but next week, text in and join us again we don't know the show yet, but we'll come up with something.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
All right.
If you have an idea for a show, let us know.
Yes.
If you want to be on the show.
And remember, you're listening to KCIWLP in beautiful Brookings, Oregon.
And this has been the Curry Café.
Curry Café.